Good afternoon and welcome to the PI Education Somewhat Monthly webinar brought to you by Pursuit Magazine. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. We're absolutely tickled you're here. If you have comments or questions, feel free to share them in the YouTube chat function. I will get to those as quickly as I can. Avi Klein is a private investigator in Oakland, California, with a law degree from USC. He's also a former investigative journalist. He covered the finance, defense, and national security industries from Washington, D.C. Avi is managing partner at the Klein Group, a firm specializing in litigation support, due diligence for investors, locating heirs, and defending contested wills. Check out his LinkedIn page. If you go there, he shares a lot of really good information about the investigative world, due diligence, background investigations, and skip tracing. In one post, Avi writes about real locates, assignments to find people who are tough to trace, like the unhoused, recent college grads, or people who change addresses frequently. A real locate puts the investigative professional to the proof, Avi writes. You need a Swiss Army knife full of tools for each circumstance. I love that. It really captures the investigator's skill set. And today, Avi Klein and I will talk about some of the tools in his Swiss Army knife of skills. Avi Klein, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you become a private investigator?
I have probably one of the more unique routes into the business. I was in law school, and I realized very early on I didn't want to practice law. I loved what I was learning. I liked the people I was with, but I didn't like legal writing, and I just did not see myself as a corporate lawyer. And instead, I went to Washington, D.C., and I became a journalist, and I eventually came to work in politics. And basically, my entire career has been in public records research and bothering people on the phone and getting them to talk to me when they shouldn't. And that's really all that I know how to do. After working in DC for a while, I talked my way into a job with the Obama campaign on the re-election in 2012.
Okay.
I became the world's expert in Bain Capital while I was there, where I wrote about a 500-page book on the company. And then after that, I really realized I needed a big boy job. I was already pretty old for the political business, and the next career step would have been to take a research director position on a Senate campaign in Nebraska or something like that. And my wife had been very, very nice about moving with me to Washington, D.C. To Chicago to run, a presidential campaign. It was like an opportunity of a lifetime, but she wasn't going to go with me to Nebraska to do that again. And I had some sense that there was something called a corporate investigations industry out there. You read about it in the papers, names like Kroll, you'd see pop up in the Times here and there. And I found a connection that I had, just sort of a networking connection with the Minsk Group, which was a big international investigations company. International, they probably have about 300 or 400 investigators by now, offices in China and in India and all over the United States. And what I did is I just talked myself into a job there. I was like, this is what I want to do. And I figured out a way to get the job that I wanted. And I was able to really just begin my professional career as an investigator by just going right to the top. And I worked there for about 4.5 years, where I did a lot of investigative work. I did a lot of due diligence work. And I also learned a lot about the business of investigations, which I think is often overlooked. I think it's really important for people, if they're thinking about going out on their own, or even if they're not, to have some sort of understanding of where the money is made and how to work with clients and how to operate effectively in a corporate world, which is totally different than politics and totally different from being a journalist in DC. In fact, it was the first time in my life when I was at Minsk Group that I was with a company that had an HR department and policies and structure of any kind. But it was a great place to learn the business and to learn some of the fundamental building blocks, including about locates at the Minsk Group.
When I talk to people about this business, I came up through the real estate appraisal world. My father was a real estate appraiser. I grew up holding the dumb end of the tape for him, measuring houses and doing that stuff. But I find that the skill set from being a real estate appraiser is identical to the skill set of being an investigative journalist or being an investigator. And those worlds have a lot of overlap. And when you said, I spend a lot of time on the phone calling people and pestering them for information that they don't necessarily want to share. As a commercial valuation professional, that's all I did. I spent time on the phone asking people questions that they had no reason to share the information. I tell people, as private investigators, we've got charm and good looks. And, I'm batting about 300.
I definitely think I have maybe more charm than good looks, but one of the things that you've mentioned, Hal, which I think is actually really important and something that I have a sort of a general concern about in the industry, is young people today have a very, very hard time on the telephone. And I always say, if you never had to call up a girl on the phone, in high school and get past her dad and then talk to her and summon up the courage to ask her to go with you to the ice cream parlor or whatever you're going to do, this is really, really hard. It's not an easy thing. And nowadays, of course, my understanding is they don't call people on the phone to ask for dates. They send texts that say, hey, what's up and what you doing, and then they sort of do it that way, and that does not work. And I'm not even talking about being able to call a source and being able to get the source to work with you and help them understand that they could be helpful to you and all that. But even just something as simple as, can you call up a court clerk in Wichita and get her to send over some court records right now, and you can't wait for anything, and sweet talk them into doing that for you in an authentic way? That too is a really important skill set that I fear is being lost.
Yeah, and when you're talking about public records and courthouse and people that work in the courthouse, I've talked to investigators well, I just send them a demand letter and tell them, based on FOIA laws, I need to have access. I'm like, no. You have to sweet talk your way into these people's lives. You have to realize if you're in rural Tennessee and you go to the courthouse on a Wednesday, you better get there before noon because the courthouse closes at noon on Wednesdays. You got to know those kind of things. So you went to law school. You and I were chatting before we went live. One of the things I think that's really interesting about law school is it kind of rewires the brain. And that's one thing that I'm incredibly jealous of, is just having that kind of education. But it's not necessary to be an investigator to have gone to law school. You worked with the Mintz Group, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, in the San Francisco.
Tell me about that. What was that like?
So for those who don't know, I mentioned, the Mintz Group is a big international investigations firm. It was founded by a guy named Jim Mintz, who's a fantastic fellow. He was part of the same world, contemporary with guys like Jules Kroll and Nardello, and a bunch of guys who came out of the 1970s as investigative journalists or having worked on the Watergate Committee as investigators, jobs like that. And they realized they could make a lot more money if they would sell their services to the burgeoning private equity business that was developing in New York in the early 1980s, and in the defense and the growing consulting business that was taking over Washington, D.C., starting in sort of the mid to late 80s. And they built out these really fantastic investigations businesses. And what distinguished Mintz, I think, from Kroll and from these others, and it is not to take anything away from them, was they emphasized hiring very creative people to work for them. So when I was at Mintz, there were colleagues of mine that had written books, that were working on screenplays, that were actively doing all kinds of very, very creative things. They were not ex-law enforcement guys. They were not former cops or FBI. They were just creative thinkers who sort of knew their way around not just public records, not just with source inquiries, but also with language. Because one of the things the Mintz Group also really emphasized was very clear writing, paying very close attention to what you're putting down on paper, and testing what you've written down. So, part of what you do is, you write up a memo or something for the partner, and then they go through it and they're like, how do you know that? You're saying that, but is that really what you're saying? Because there's a tendency with, for all of us to kind of round off the edges of what we know to sound more confident, and it sounds more like you've accomplished something. And they would say, no, if we don't know entirely, we just say we don't know entirely, and we use some language, but we say what we do know right up front. And it was fantastic training. I worked on some incredible front page cases my first year there. Um, and just got a tremendous education on how to do this work, and then how, as I mentioned, how to work it as a business itself.
Sorry, we spend a lot of time here on Pursuit Magazine talking about the business of investigations. And at the end of the day, if you don't make money, you cannot continue to do investigations. You have to get paid and you have to keep track of those things. And I think working for a larger company like that gives you an eye into how that stuff is done. And if you're coming to it as a solo operator like I did, that's a real struggle to get your head around the business side. So that's really, really cool that you had that. So tell us a little bit about the Klein Group and what areas of private investigations Klein specializes in.
So one of the things that happened in my career when I was at Mintz Group is the industry largely had already been shifting to a great focus on due diligence work, very high end, very expensive background checking for private equity firms, for national pension firms, companies like that. And I did not really like it very much. Um, Background checking, when you first get into it, is very interesting, and that's a fundamental skill set that you have to learn because you learn how to operate all the different types of databases, how to write properly, how to put a memo together, how to think about next steps. But if you do it for years and years and years, it becomes a little tedious. And I was finding it was taking more of my time. And what I really like doing is investigations. I really like working for litigators. I was in law school and I like lawyers. I like the things that lawyers do. I like disputes, but I don't really want to work in the dispute. I don't want to be a disputant. I don't like people being angry with me. I didn't want to fight over discovery all the time and spend my days hassling with all that. I really like the factual aspect of what I do. And so when I went out on my own, my business strategy was to say, I think there's a big market out here in the middle market between the guys who most private investigators are, which are doing this retail work, they're doing surveillance projects and things like that, and these very, very high-end companies like the one that I was leaving, where the rates are very, very, very high, and the projects are very, very, very expensive. And what I wanted to do was to bring that exact same model and skill set just to the mid market, to attorneys who are not going to hire a company like Kroll or Mintz. And they're budget conscious. They're just not going to do that, and it's not really an appropriate fit for them. There are great companies and great projects that are not a good fit for me and are a great fit for Mintz because they require 25 investigators and 10 different languages and a forensic accountant and all those types of things. And I'm not trying to sell that, and not interested in doing that. What I like is working with attorneys on their fact gathering projects. Because one of the things I always say is the lawyers, their job is to apply the law to the facts. That's what their job is. They tend not to be very good at finding out the facts outside of the discovery process. They always sort of want to wait for discovery to resolve any kind of factual holes in their cases. And when I go out and I talk to lawyers, I say, look, you can go and get better facts for your cases right now. There's a whole universe of information about the parties that are involved in their history and their relationships together. There's all kinds of information out there about how much money they have and whether they might be able to pay off a judgment, assuming you get one. There are factual claims we can go and test right now. You're going to go and do all this thing with discovery and fight with opposing counsel, and that's going to take you a whole year before you get anything useful. And it's also very expensive to process all the discovery that you're going to get, and they're going to throw a lot of chaff at you and try to distract you. But with me and my team, we can get in right away, long before discovery is a question, and start compiling facts. And as a matter of fact, it often works very well because the more you know, the more a lawyer has on the table before discovery, then the better job they can do of crafting discovery, because they can ask for something specifically if they know about it. And if they don't get it, then they have cause to complain, to say, we already know this document exists. How come you didn't turn it over? And so now, as far as my practice goes, instead of it being about 25% litigation, 75% due diligence when I was at Mintz, it's pretty much flipped. And it's about 75% litigation, 25 due diligence. And that works out really well for me. I'm afraid I can't hear you, Hal.
How about now?
There you go.
I love the idea of taking that bigger company model and applying it to a smaller company that services lawyers that wouldn't normally go for those kind of services. I mean, at the end of the day, you said something that I've said a gazillion times, which is the lawyer's job is to know how to apply the law to the facts. They go to law school. That's what they know. Our job is to deliver as many facts as possible so they know what to apply the law to. And I think that's really important to point out. So let's talk a little bit about skip tracing and locates and talk about what those things mean. What is a skip trace? What is a locate?
So often, I think in contemporary usage, people use the term skip trace and locate as think they're the same word. They use them analogously, and I don't think that that's correct. I think a skip trace is something where the word skip is in there. And I think this word must go back to the notion of a person skipping town or skipping bail, which is they are a creditor. They owe somebody money and somebody's chasing after them in order to get that money. That's what happens when you skip bail. You've lost money for the bail bondsman and he's got to go get you in order so he can get his bond redeemed. And a skip trace really means this is a person who is evading. They are doing everything they can to avoid being caught. They don't want to go to prison or they don't want to pay the debt. And they're hiding in some way. I want to distinguish that from mainly what I do, which is what I call locates, which is the person is not trying to escape from anyone. I'm not doing bail bond recovery and I'm not doing debt collection for anyone. My clients are all lawyers, and what they want is they need an address on a guy or a gal because either they have to serve them or they have to send them a letter. And the work that they've done to date hasn't produced the result they want. And that usually happens for one of two reasons. One is they don't have any database resources whatsoever. They have no idea where the guy might be. They haven't put any effort into it. And a lot of the times in cases like that, it's actually pretty easy. It's like looking up a name in a phone book, because for most people who aren't evading and who aren't in a sort of a class of person who can be hard to find, the database report is going to give you what you want. If you tried to look up my mother and did a skip trace on my mother, you would have absolutely no problem finding her because she's lived in the same house for 40 years. So there's no issue there. But there are cases, and this happens regularly, where they do have an address. They looked it up in Nexus People Search. They tried it. And now they don't know where the guy is. It didn't work. They sent a process server and it didn't work. For one reason or another, it didn't work. And that's when I'll get an email from the person saying, from the lawyer. I got one today, as a matter of fact, from a lawyer saying, this guy, he's evading, can you try to find him? And then I look at the process server report and I'm like, this guy's not evading anything. You went to his business office, but it's COVID times and he's not going to his office all the time. That's not the issue. He's not evading you. We just need to find a home address for him. And, often these can be more complicated. There are cases that are, maybe we'll talk more about this. There are cases where people who are homeless or college students and recently divorced people, where you have to do a little bit more work. And we're going to talk about this whole tool set. But I think the main distinguishing feature between a locate and a skip trace is that with a skip trace, the person is evading. With a locate, the problem is on your end. The other person's not doing anything. It's on your end. You just don't have a good address for them. You'll get one, but you're going to have to put in some work in order to find it first.
One of the things that I find interesting in the process of locates, not someone that's evading, like you said, just trying to find someone. Number one, I like to do the research myself. When an attorney or a paralegal does the research, I don't know if they checked alternate spellings. I don't know if they checked a bunch of different things that I would check. So a lot of times I'll get an address, say, hey, go talk to this witness, and they're not there. And it's simply because I know how to do that locate research, right? The other thing is, do you sometimes, and I'll say I do this, the harder a person is to find, you start to build this narrative in your own mind that they're evading you, and they're really not. You just haven't gotten to the right spot yet.
I think that's right. And I think what you're getting at, though, is one of the kind of the instincts or the feelings that makes for a really good investigator, which is, I've got to get this guy. And you're getting upset because you can't get him. Like, I don't care if my clients sue this guy. It has nothing to do with me. but it's sort of like the ultimate prey, man. You're trying to. I want to get this guy, and I want to nail him, and you do take it personally. There's been one I've been working on for like 2 months for a guy who very, very early on in his life decided he was going to stay off the grid. As a professional person, but he's consistently for 20 years only used a UPS box. It's even on his driver's license. Everything like that. And I did every trick that we're going to talk about here, I've done on this guy, and I still haven't got him. And this is the only guy I've ever not gotten, and it really makes me angry. Like I really need to get him.
I had one out in New Mexico years ago, and it had taken a long time to track this person down. They lived not off the grid, but far enough away from the grid that it was really different. And finally, when I got there, I was like, my goodness, it's been a real struggle to find you. And the guy said, I've been right here.
Yeah. Well, it's worth pointing out, too, and this is something that investigators and lawyers sometimes overlook, partly because they don't think of it, partly because they like the thrill of the chase. But you can call the guy. You can just call the guy and say, hey, I have legal papers for you. Could we just arrange to meet? And with professional people, this will often work because professional people like I said, they're not hiding. They know that you don't gain anything from evading service. You're going to get served eventually. If I have to, I'm just going to put a guy in your house and just wait for you to come out. Like, you're going to get caught. But wouldn't you rather just do this in an easy way? Because otherwise, I might pop out when you're at a business meeting at the Starbucks with a client. Or my guy's going to come out and aggressively serve you and your wife when you're taking the kids to school. And we don't want to do that. I don't like embarrassing anyone. I don't get anything from that. I just want the person served. And there is sometimes people feel, well, we don't want to alert them because if we alert them, then they'll start evading. But it doesn't make sense. Like, most people can't evade. We caught a guy, a Hollywood executive, who had been evading. Like, he wasn't answering the door. He could see us on the camera. He wasn't answering. They sent the regular process service like 12 times. But, I just send a guy down and sit outside his Beverly Hills house for 3 hours in the morning, starting at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., he comes out to take a walk with a dog, and boom, like, that's it. So,
yeah,
there's no point to any of that.
Yeah. I want to talk real quick before we get into talking about the Swiss Army knife of tools, which I think is why most people are here. When you're doing locates, when you're doing skip tracing assignments, there are some liability issues you need to think about. There's a famous case up in the Northeast where a private investigator tracked down a young lady for an individual. Turns out the individual was her ex-boyfriend. He killed her, and the PI was held criminally responsible for that. So let's talk about the liability and legalities of skip tracing and locates.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And this comes up a lot for PIs. I get calls like this, both from potential retail clients and even from lawyers who will tell me a story about, I'm trying to track down my ex-girlfriend from 20 years ago. The guy probably just got divorced. Now he's thinking about lost loves. Or sometimes it'll happen with a person who's like a grown child who they don't have contact with now, and they want to check up on them, make sure they're okay, or maybe try to re-engage the relationship. And I always tell people when they ask me about that I don't think that's a good idea, but that if they would like me to do the work, and I think this is the ethical standard, that if you want me to find a person, and there's no litigation involved here, we're not talking about process service, I'm happy to do the effort to find a person, but I'm going to contact them and tell them that you are looking for them and ask them if they want me to put them in touch. And every single time I say that, the person says, no, never mind. And maybe they go to a different private investigator. I don't know. But of course, if you're thinking about your lost love from college, to think that the first call they're going to get is, hi, my name is Avi Klein. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by John Smith to find you. That's not really a good look and a good start to your romantic escapades. So, I just don't end up with those clients at all. For the skip traces that I do, 99.99% of them are for lawyers who are giving me lawful papers, and they're saying we need to serve these. And I conceivably they could do something like that as a ruse to me. There could be some lawyer who did that, and you could write up this whole complaint, I suppose. But I don't think that's what's happening. So I don't really worry about the ethical issues there. But I am always very conscious So I don't do the process serving myself, except in sort of very extreme or unusual circumstances, if it maybe requires a certain touch. But most of the time, you don't need someone like me. I'm way too expensive to be spent to just go do process service. And I don't live in LA, say, where I do a lot of work. So I'll send a guy to do it. But it is really important when you're working with other people to make sure that they understand some of the ethical issues that are involved here. Namely, we are not trespassing anywhere. And we are obeying all laws, and we are not making any scenes. We're not embarrassing anyone. We're not doing anything that's just not the work of serving paper. And when you hire other people, there are a lot of PIs out there, and there are a lot of really good PIs who do surveillance and service and things like that. But there are a lot of guys who are not good or are very, very afraid of not getting results because they fear that you won't hire them if they don't get the findings. And, I've had a case once where a guy was out in the field and he was going to wait to do service on someone. He was getting antsy. It was like an all-day thing and nothing was happening and he was bored and maybe he wanted to go home to his family. And he sent me a text and he said, I'm just going to sneak up on the property and look in the window to see if they're home. And I had to call the guy on the phone and I'm like, first of all, don't do that. And number two, don't send me any texts about that if you're going to do it. It's unnecessary. We can always come back another day.
I was talking to a lawyer the other day, talking about text messaging and emails, and he said, "You know what email stands for, right?" And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Evidence made available in litigation."
That's right.
Well, we're right up against the halfway mark, so I'm going to take just a minute and acknowledge some of the folks that have joined us today. Let's see, MC Murray from Louisiana, thank you so much for being here today. Of course, we've got our lovely Stephanie Mitchell. She is the operations manager here at PI Education. She does a fantastic job. John Tremblador joins us almost every time we have a webinar. John, good to have you in the room. Thanks for being here. Steve Mason out in Arizona. If y'all don't know Steve, get to know him. He's a heck of a guy, good investigator. Steve, thank you for being here. Peter DeMunez from Salem, Oregon. Always nice to have folks from Oregon in the room. Good to have you here. Steve Koenig out of Nebraska. Steve is active on Twitter. Good investigator. Good to have you in the room. Let's see here. David Gonzalez, thanks for being with us today. And then Gary Webb is here today as well. Let's see who else we got. We've got a couple other folks in here. Joseph Silva from Montana. Joseph, thanks for being here. E. Thomas from New York. Thanks for being here, buddy. Joe out in Honolulu, Hawaii. Joe has joined us for virtual cocktail hours a couple of times. Super good dude out there in Honolulu, Hawaii. Joe, thanks for being here. And we've got GWB from Oregon in the room. Thanks for being here. I'm going to switch over to the Hal Humphreys screen just for a second. If you are watching us on YouTube, do me a favor, go down below this video and subscribe to our YouTube feed. It doesn't cost you a thing and it helps us out a great deal. So subscribe to the YouTube feed. We'd love to have you be a subscriber. If you want to find us online, pursuitmag.com. It's the best place to find all things Pursuit Magazine, and it's a good front door to PI education. If you want to find me, the best place to find me is on Twitter at FindPI. Pursuit Magazine is also on Twitter at PursuitMag. PI Education, again, at PI Education over there on Twitter. And then if you want to find Avi, the best place to find him is on LinkedIn. I found him on Twitter, and he said, no, share the LinkedIn feed because that's where I do most of my interacting with folks out there in the world. So we've given you places to find us. Please reach out if you have questions. And if you're on the live YouTube feed and you have questions, feel free to post them to the chat feature. We'll get to those as we can. So Avi, we've talked about your background working in the Mintz Group, starting the Klein Group. We've talked about locates and skip tracing and those kind of things. We've kind of touched on the legalities and liabilities of those kind of things. I do want to talk about FDCPA, FCRA, Gramm-Leach Bliley, all those things. Just briefly, when you're using databases, they have permissions that you have to select. Do know this, that TLO, Clear, what are some other ones? IDI Core. All of those services are fantastic services, a good place to start your research. They are not the arbiter of everything about a person. Like they literally are a good place to start your research. But do know this, they audit your searches. And I have in the past gotten a letter from TLO and gotten a letter from IDI saying, hey, these 5 searches you did on this day, do you have a reason for having done those? And have a reason for doing searches. Don't use those databases to find your old high school sweetheart.
That's absolutely right. I will admit that, hopefully TLO is not watching and I'm not going to get any trouble for this, but there have been times where I wasn't sure of my friend's birthday or something like that, and I knew it was coming up, and I didn't collect the permissible uses, and I searched, and I looked it up because I was like, is it today or tomorrow? And it's going to be so embarrassing. But, I feel that every investigator gets, 1 or 2 little ones like that every year. And hopefully TLO is not going to give me a hard time because I looked at my buddy's birthday. But it is very important to have the permissible uses, to be thoughtful about the reason you're doing it. They will audit, and I'm usually very, very careful. I have a lot of clients in LA in the entertainment industry, and a lot of the work that I do involves people who are celebrities or athletes and things like that. And I'm very conscious. I was a couple months ago, a client wanted me to serve someone who is one of the most famous athletes in the whole world, an incredibly wealthy person, and they needed to locate them. And I was immediately like, okay, I've got to take the most conservative approach here with the permissible uses. I'm going to be very, very careful. If I don't have to do it, I'm not going to do it because I do not want to get a trigger because I searched on this person's name. And, my reasons were totally kosher. I was working with a law firm. There was active litigation naming this person. There was no issue, but you don't want to go through that anyways.
No.
And I have heard cases. I remember when I was at Mintz Group, this happened where something similar, and someone searched someone and automatically their TLO access was cut off. Like the minute they searched it, it was just like, if you're searching on this person, something no good is happening. We're closing you down.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was all resolved in the end, but you don't want to have those type of hiccups. Which, by the way, is maybe a nice time to just mention, I maintain subscriptions to 4 different public records databases. And one of the reasons is, in addition to having different sources of information, that if I were to run into some misunderstanding with TLO or my automatic billing payments for some reason stopped and they cut me off, you need to have backup because that's almost certainly going to be the day that the important client calls up and they need you to go find someone to do something. It's never the day when it's all set. It's when you don't have it, and then you're going to be scrambling and in trouble. So it's a belt and suspenders approach.
Yeah, and then you've got to call your attorney client and say, hey, can I use your TLO? And it gets awkward.
To go back to your client and say, well, I can't do it today, but I'm hoping TLO will let me get it to you on Friday is not a good look.
Yeah. All right. So we've covered those things. So you've got your database searches, and like I always say, it's a good place to start. TLO, IDI, Clear, those are not background investigations. So you've got a difficult locate. Let's talk about some tools that you use. And I'm going to start with one that I noticed on your LinkedIn page. And one of the things you shared on LinkedIn, you talked about you got some discovery before it was actually required to be turned over from a DA, and they had redacted a lot of information about the person, but you were able to find out their name and get in touch with them. Talk to us about that if you can.
Sure. What I'd like to actually back up just for a second to kind of frame up the whole idea, because you were talking about databases, and I think databases, while you're right that they are not the full investigation, are always a very good place to start, because really what you want to do is you want to start broad and kind of narrow and funnel a little bit. And a skilled investigator will pull a report like TLO and start sizing up the person a little bit just based on that. It's not everything. There's lots of other work to be done. But if there's real valuable data in there and you're looking through it, you're going to get a sense of who is this person? Is this a person who moves a lot? Some people are just very transient in their ways, not for any nefarious reason, but they just happen to go from place to place and they never really settle down. Or maybe they only have ever lived in one place, and then you're like confused, like, why is it I can't find this guy? Why weren't they able to find this guy? This guy doesn't seem to be moving around, so what's the issue here? Or, this guy likes to buy and sell property a lot. I see a lot of real estate transactions with this guy. Or I see a bunch of tax liens all of a sudden, really like very recent ones. Maybe this guy's under some sort of financial stress. That could tell us something.
Yeah.
You're looking for all that kind of stuff to kind of give yourself an initial impression of who the person is. You can't be wedded to it. This is just your sort of initial foray into it, but you want to have something to guide you. You don't want to just start mindlessly just running your searches off in a checklist kind of way. That's the sign of an amateur investigator who wants a checklist and is going to literally punch in the person's name in 100 different databases and wait, hopefully if I push the right ones, the answer is going to come to me. One eye looks so smart. But our clients do not pay us to mechanically run searches. Any person can run any of these searches, and with 10 minutes of training, it's not a big deal. What they pay for is our brains, our ability to take all this information and leverage it in an efficient way to get the right results. Because also, locates are not typically budget-heavy tasks. I do some very, very expensive, complicated investigations, but locates, the clients have a sort of a reasonable budget for what they think that something like this should cost. And that's going to differ for where you are in the market and who your clients are. But you need to be able to do it in 2 or 3 hours in order to do it in a way that's efficient for the client. And so developing a good sense at the beginning of where you're going to be going is a good way to start in a very efficient way and hopefully end in that way.
Yeah, and using the databases as a tool to start getting that picture of what the person is like and where they might have been, where they may be, those kind of things. I think it's fantastic. We've gotten a couple of questions from the crowd. Gabby Webb here in L.A., which databases do you like best? And then Scott Fulmer out of Texas says, which 4 does he use? So let's talk about databases. We're not giving specific recommendations here, but what do you like?
So I just want to give a shout out to the person who asked. That's Anne Lejeunesse, who is an absolutely fantastic investigator down in the LA area, an absolute expert in public records and criminal records searching. So I just want to give her a shout out. She's absolutely fantastic. I use TLO as my primary. I think it has very good California coverage, and I'm used to it. I think all investigators kind of have the one that they're just the most comfortable with. We have to be honest here. Almost all of them are pulling from the exact same data brokers. And there's often almost no difference between them. You're looking, though, for the times when might be a slight difference. Some are a little bit more strong in some jurisdictions than others. Some lay out the data that you're looking for a little bit better. They make searching and going from one place to another through just a link easier. So I use TLO as my primary. I have IDI, which I think is fine. I have Delve Point. I have Tracers, which I think is very, very good for phone numbers. I really, really like Tracers for that. And those are the big primary databases that I have. But I also have a full Nexus subscription, a full Westlaw subscription, and then a bunch of small little one-off kind of things to get DMV records or change of address form information or real estate records to see the originals, a whole host of little ones like that. But those are all the main ones that I use.
Okay, good deal. So let's get into the difficult ones. And are you comfortable talking about the one that I brought up? It's on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm sorry. I just got distracted trying to frame everything up, but I'm happy to talk about that.
I totally
think it's a good entry.
It's one of those things where you just have like a little so talk about that one if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. So anytime you're doing a tough locate, you're looking to find anything that's real. You're trying to find something where you can really establish that at least on that particular date that person was in this place. That's really what you're trying to get a hold of, because then when you have that, you can build off that to the next step. They might not be there anymore, but then you could at least have a place where they started, and then maybe you can find a change of address form from there to see where they went or something like that. And anytime you're looking through public records, we're outside the databases now and we're just looking at documents that we can find. you're looking for that little piece of information that's going to get you to the next stage, something solid you can hold on to. And sometimes you have to overcome the efforts of other people to try to hide that from you. Sometimes it's the person themselves. They are making it hard to find you by using a mail forwarding service, and they're hiding. You can't find them, and you got to find something that's going to direct you to their address. In this case that you're describing, we had gotten this was a white collar defense case that I've been working on, and the other side has a confidential witness, and they're not telling us who the confidential witness is. But as part of sort of the early stages of discovery, long before they're going to have to identify this guy who turned on my client, they had to turn over the arrest records from when that guy was arrested and when he was brought in, and immediately gave up, all his code of honor in order to finger my client for this crime. And they had dutifully redact all the personal information about the guy, the name, the date of birth, his address, his social security number. But these were arrest records, and on it was a booking number. And they didn't redact the booking number. They were probably not thinking about that the booking number was something that could allow someone to connect that piece of paper to a real person. But in this jurisdiction, and this is common in many, many jurisdictions, you can go to the online sheriff's office or the jail roster and search for a person by the booking number. Now, probably the idea is your family member has just been arrested and you called the police and they gave you a booking number to help them and reach out to your loved one. But of course, I'm just going to take that and put it into the county website. And the first thing that's going to pop up is just the guy's name and sometimes a mugshot saying he's incarcerated or he was incarcerated in this jail. Then, of course, once I've got the name and, of course, his date of birth is right there on the record, it's a criminal record, then it's just child's play to fully identify the guy and figure out where he is, all because of this one little nugget of information. And this was something where it was a major concern for the client. They really wanted to know who this person was. They wanted to develop their defense as early as possible. And in talking to the client, he gave me this sort of big impression. This was going to be very hard and very challenging and see what you can do. But for me, it was once I was going through it and I saw that booking number, this was half an hour of work to find and identify this confidential informant. And now my client is 9 months ahead of where he would have been in developing. And now we're doing a background check on that guy. And we have plenty of time to pull old criminal records out of archives in order to find this guy. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't located that one little number and wondered, what can I do with that? I wonder if there's something I could do with that number. And that's kind of, I think, the approach is anytime you're looking at the record, you're like, where in this document is any kind of thing that I could leverage off of? And I think the concept of leverage is really important because a lever works by putting a small little thing under a big thing to lift it. And that's what you're looking for, that small little thing that's going to lift up your case and get you to the next stage.
Yeah, and just noticing those little things along the way, paying attention to those little details. One of the reasons I like going to actual courthouses and pawing through public records is a lot of times, I find the document I'm looking for, but attendant to that, 1, 2, 3 documents back will be other information related to it. For instance, if I have a property record and I've got a deed showing a transfer, a lot of times immediately behind that will be a deed of trust, which has even more information. So one of the things I want to make sure we get to, so I'm going to hit it first, social media. I know a lot of investigators talk about OSINT and, how we're super sleuths and we can do all this stuff, and social media is a great resource, but there are some tactics that are great, but let's talk about what's legal and what works and what your idea of best practices is for social media research.
So I use social media. Social media research has changed a lot since I first got into this business, even back when I was in politics, when you would be looking on people's Facebook accounts to try to find pictures of a guy doing a keg stand or, being draped with naked ladies or something like that. And the whole idea was like, you shouldn't post anything on social media that you don't want other people to see. And it would be like disqualifying and things like that. We're actually in a totally different world now that the standards of what you have to do in public in order to be disqualifying, they've really gone pretty high now because it's so common. And what I'm using social media for, particularly with locates, is I'm trying to confirm information that I already have, but I'm not sure about. And this happens very, very commonly when you've got an address that you think might be good. You've got a person who's moving a lot. These are usually working class people who, aren't able to stay in one place, or they move a lot, and you're not sure exactly where they are. The databases are a little confused. You're pretty sure they're got to be in one of these addresses. The person's not hiding, but you're not really sure which one. But people like to post in our modern world about their day-to-day lives. It's not about the drunkenness or the party or even being with a celebrity. People just post pictures of their kids on Instagram, or they show themselves, outside the balcony on their house. And for me, that's what I'm looking for is, can I get a picture of where this person is? Because if I can get a picture of where this person lives, I can probably find a picture of their house or their apartment or an apartment in the same complex on the internet. People, obviously on Redfin, which is a gold mine of imagery of inside people's houses, in similar real estate databases, but also for apartment listings. So a person lives in an apartment, but that apartment building is often going to have a big website, and they want people to go and look and see how beautiful all the rooms are. And one thing that's always very telling is a kitchen, because a kitchen has got all kinds of things in it that are unique really to that room. Lots of other places, white walls, all apartments have white walls, but that countertop, those types of cabinets, the location of the refrigerator or the sink versus everything else. And if I could get a glimpse of that on your Instagram, because you posted a picture of yourself making a rigatoni, then I can leverage that, and then I know exactly where you are. And that's really how I use it for the most part. The other way you use it is trying to figure out who knows this person.
Yeah, I use it. I use it a lot. I use it a lot of times when I've got a person with a fairly common name, so maybe I get 4 or 5 returns, and I think that I've got a good database report on the person I'm looking for. But if I go onto Facebook and I start seeing friends and moms and dads that are relatives listed on Facebook that are the same as one of the database searches, I'm like, got it, golden.
And also, it's really important when doing social media and all these other ones is if you could identify another person who lives with that person, you also have a real edge. So I want to know, if this person's not married, what's her boyfriend's name? Well, people very often, they post very nice pictures, or they say, in a relationship with John Smith or something like that. Now, if that woman that I'm looking for, a new address for her hasn't popped, but maybe that's because when they moved to the new apartment, they moved in together and all the utilities are in her boyfriend's name. I recently did a great serve that was, this woman was totally shocked and could not understand what had happened based on the fact that her husband had recently gotten a California Guard card to become a security guard. And he had listed an address that I had never seen before on his Guard card application. It was just there in the database. And sure enough, then when I had that address, I could go back to the woman's social media. I see the pictures of her kids, and I can now open up the Google Maps and say, oh yeah, that's exactly the yard those kids are playing in. And my investigator just went out there and just sat out and waited for the lady to come home from work, and then boom, served.
Boom, done. So social media has a lot of nuances, and I think you're right. It ends up being a verification tool for me more so than an investigative tool, but I know there's some investigative uses. Let's move on to some other things, because there are a lot of nuggets here in this Swiss Army knife of tools. And for those of you in the room, we're at about 4:18 right now, so we may not get real deep into all of these things. But what I will do, if you're comfortable with it, I may post some of these listings on the YouTube channel there for people to see, the things we were going to talk about, and just to point them in the direction of some options.
Sure.
Court filings.
Super critical. The first thing you want to look for, aside from databases, or court filing. Remember, we're looking for anything that's like a real record, somewhere where a person has made a claim or a statement about where they live. And if you could find a recent court filing that they've been involved with, maybe they've been divorced, and that can be tough because the person has moved out, they're not a new database, they're staying with their cousin for a while before they get on their feet. But maybe there's a new address on there. Or where this becomes really critical is with people who are mentally ill and homeless. Your best shot with a mentally ill or homeless person is not in the databases at all, because they're not really connected. All this data comes from the credit system, and mail order and things like that. And they're not doing any of that. They're in a cash world. And if they have a cell phone, they're doing, prepaid cards and all that because they're quite poor and unstable. But the truth is that homeless people, and especially the mentally ill, they rub up against the criminal and civil justice system all the time. They get arrested for harassing people. They end up getting drunk in public. They do all kinds of, they themselves end up suing other people because in their own mental derangement, they think other people are persecuting them. And now all of a sudden they've got to list an address. And so maybe that address is going to be a homeless shelter. Maybe it's a relative's house. Maybe in the report, there's a police report which says, this guy, we found him. He says he usually hangs out by such and such a subway station. That's kind of where he hangs out. You get a date of anything like that, you're sucking out of the court records because people are putting in information, a lot of information into a court filing that you can leverage on.
So yeah, court filings, court records are just a gold mine. You have to know how to kind of paw through them. Phone registrations.
Mm-hmm. So, this is where tracers is really good, right? So we're not talking about someone's phone records in the sense of who they called or listening in on them, but cell phones are one thing that people really keep close and they need to have. And a person has a cell phone bill, even if they don't have a utility bill at that house. And finding out through tracers or something somewhere else that this is a cell phone, that the billing is associated with that address, is not proof. None of these things are proof. And I think it's really important also to understand, and it's important to relay to clients, like all we can know is like, where's the last best shot where the person was? If we do that, we're doing our job. But that person, even though that might be the right address, I can't control if he's on vacation this week or he went up to Colorado to take care of his ailing mother for the last 3 months. I don't know. We still have to do the work, but we're trying to get the last best shot at it. And so cell phone records like that are often a good way to tie a person down, like with a utility bill, to a person who doesn't otherwise have utilities at an address.
Right. Press archives. You're a former journalist. My wife is a journalist still to this day. I've dipped a toe in those waters, but like press archives are a really good source for information.
They are. And, I use them a lot if I'm doing something for a will and trust attorney. I'll do these genealogical searches where there's nothing adversarial happening, but a person died intestate. He has no children. His parents are long dead. And something is happening with the will, and they need to notice the heirs. But this guy was estranged from his family from the time he was 18 years old, before the Second World War. And his heirs, the people who are dealing with it now, have no idea if he has any relatives or not. And I find Ancestry.com and newspapers.com, when you marry them together, to be very, very effective. I mean, on the newspaper side, it's because in the olden days, it was much more common for people to submit voluminous obituaries to the newspapers. I don't think you see that all that much anymore, but it used to be very, very common. And every obituary has got a very long list of all the people that survived the deceased and the names of their spouses. And you can start going through that and you're like, oh, well, I've got all the names of all the brothers and sisters here. They're all right here. Well, now I got to go find them and all that. But this press archive very easily and very nicely showed me where it was. It can also very similarly, if there are factual disputes about where a person was at a certain time or date in the past, newspaper archive is also very, very good for that, by establishing if a person was in a location that was reported on or something like that.
Here's a good one. E. Thomas, are LPR databases of repo companies available for searches?
This sounds like a setup, because this is like my favorite topic to discuss with people, and I've talked about it on LinkedIn. Yes, license plate readers mounted by repo companies are an unbelievable and troubling resource for private investigators. Just so everyone understands, we're not talking about license plate readers that are mounted. You see them now all the time, at least where I live, on police cars and on the parking enforcement vehicles and on when you go through a toll booth and things like that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something that's actually kind of clever, which is the repo industry. Of course, they are very motivated to know where all the cars are that they might want to repo so they can repo them effectively. And so there's a company that has mounted, they have a revenue share model with all the tow truck companies. They mount these readers on the tow trucks, and then the tow trucks, they just go around all day just doing their tow truck business. But if they spot, the license plate reader spots a car that is due to be repoed, the tow truck guy can just snag it right then and get his bounty. And they figure they could sell the data to private investigators to help them find people. And this is very interesting because the data is in public. You don't have any right to privacy in public in this way. Not only that, the license plates don't even belong to you. They belong to the DMV. So in a legal sense, you have no cause to complain. So if I want to go find a person and I'm really having a hard time, it's really causing me a lot of grief, for $20 or something, I can run this search if I've got the license plate. Now I get the license plate. You've got to go step by step. I make a DMV request for all the cars that are associated with this guy, and they send that to me. And then I go to my other vendor and I take that and I get the make and the model and all that. So I get all the information I need. But what I need is the plate. And then I put my plate into this license plate reader databases, and it shows me every place where the license plate reader trucks have spotted the car. Now, of course, people go all over during the day and they go to the Safeway and they drop the kids off at school, and the plate reader could pick them up anywhere. But if you see a pattern where the plate is being picked up in the same apartment parking lot all the time or on the same street every morning, then you've got a lead. Very similar to that, which also is very helpful for skip tracing, is parking ticket data, which if you have the license plate in San Francisco and in many other places, the idea is you want to go and pay your parking ticket, but you don't have all the records right here. You don't lost those tickets, but you want to pay, you want to get straight, but you know what your license plate is, so they let you search by that. But I can take your license plate, search for it, and it'll show me all the places you got tickets. And if I see, for instance, that you've got a bunch of tickets for wrong side of the street parking for street sweeping, well, that is a ticket that you really only ever get at your own house. Well, now I've narrowed down to where you live, at least to that block. And if I already have a suspicion you might live there, again, you're done. I got you. Hal, you're muted, I'm afraid.
I hear people all the time freak out about the notion of LPRs, license plate readers, and I get it. But here's the thing. The privacy ship has sailed, people. It has just sailed.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And for all the concern, I mean, I'm one of those people who, look, I'm happy to use all these tools for my clients and my clients to succeed. And if it's lawful and ethical, then I don't have any compunction about using it. But people get very upset nowadays because Facebook is tracking them and Twitter is tracking them and knows that you like this type of food and you like to go on vacation in these places. But there's a much deeper privacy issue here with the databases, even just with the TLO stuff, which is why this happens all the time to private investigators. A potential client will come to them and say, can you find a person in Canada? And you're like, I don't know what to do, because you can't do these types of database searches in any other country in the world. It's only in the United States where basically there's an overall policy notion, it seems, rooted in our tradition, maybe going all the way back to the days of the Sears catalog as sort of the first person who had, or company that had the right to, have a private database of people's mailing addresses. But there's a real feeling, and you see it too, like in criminal jurisprudence about certain seizure issues, you have no rights of privacy outside your home, and where you live is not a private issue. And there's some truth to that, which is to say that you go in and out of your house every day. Your neighbors all know you live there. It's not really private in the same way that like your relationships with your spouse are private or your financial concerns are private. You're showing it to other people. On the other hand, you're not really showing it to the whole world and for all those purposes. And like I said, in Europe, this work can't really be done in this way at all in Europe or really anywhere else in the world. I'm lucky in the United States that we can do it this way, because anywhere else in the world you couldn't do it. And I'm much more inclined to think we should be more like Europe, and I should not be allowed to do all the things that I do. But until they stop me, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it's available and it's legal, it's a valid way to locate people. Let's move on to professional license registrations.
Sure. So this is also a very nice thing that you can do if you're looking for somebody who is a professional. So as a professionally licensed person. So a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse, a professional engineer. There are certain types of businesses where you have to have a license to conduct them. And anyone who's a lawyer or even a PI will tell you, if you move, you're supposed to update them with a new address. And it's always worth checking if the person is a professional, if you think they might have moved out of state, or if you think they might have just moved somewhere else within state, to go and search those state databases to just see if there's a new address that's popped on there. Because if a person moves out of state, they'll want to like make sure they're still getting their mail from the bar association so that they can keep up on their continuing education requirements and things like that. And that's just a small little thing. But again, it's a little thing where a person has themselves gone and affirmatively stated where they are. And anything like that is always worth checking.
All right, so it is 4:30, and we blocked out the time from 3:30 to 4:30 Central. Do you have time to go through these last few things?
Let's do it. I'm with
you. My all-time favorite, real estate records.
Real estate records, obviously, totally critical. Usually a person lives in a house that they own, if they own property. So, you want to go and just kind of see if you've got a bunch of different houses and you're not sure which is one, making sure that you've established which is the one that they own. That can be very, very important. But also more importantly is there's a lot of data that's in the filings themselves. You mentioned going and pulling a deed and then finding the deed of trust right behind it. People might be interested to know, typically the deed itself is going to be recorded with a number, and the deed of trust or the mortgage is going to have the next number in sequence because they're going to be filed in that order when the person goes at the counter. So if you don't know the mortgage number, you just add one if you've got the deed number, and you've probably got the regular number for the mortgage. But people typically on a mortgage is going to have two things that are really, really valuable to you. One is going to be a signature exemplar. The buyer doesn't sign a deed. The seller signs the deed. But the mortgage gets signed by the person who's now indebted to the mortgage company. So that could be very useful for all kinds of reasons, for identifying the right person, eliminating false positives. If you have a common name, getting a handle on a real signature exemplar that you can compare, say, to some other court document that you find. You're not sure it's the same guy who was involved in that lawsuit, but now you see a signature and that they match. Secondly, when anytime a person files a deed with the county registrar, there's a little thing on the top left which says send all mail to. And a person might buy a house as an investment property, but they don't want the county recorder's mail and information from the tax assessor going there. There's a tenant going to be there. So there's going to be a different address on the send the mail to. And that also could provide a very valuable clue as to where the person is living.
Nice. Very nice. Venmo payments. Talk to me about that. I'm not familiar with how we can use those.
Yeah, so most people nowadays know how to use Venmo. It's a very, very useful app that you can use to split bills with friends at restaurants or, coordinate children's activities and make sure everyone pays their fair share and things like that. But again, this is very similar to license plate reading. This is a real hobby horse of mine. The default settings on Venmo are totally contrary to all established privacy practices, which are they make all your transactions and your connections public to anyone who's using it, unless you affirmatively change the settings, and you have to change them separately, both the settings about your transactions and the settings about who your contacts are, because it pulls all of your contacts from your phone or from your email. Yeah, you should take care of this right away now, Hal.
I'm going to fix this right now.
But if I can see, for instance, that you're transacting with a person on there, because if I can just put your email into my phone and have it resync it, and now you're in there, and I don't have to transact with you in order to do this. I just got to find your account in Venmo as if I was going to make a payment to you. And then if I can see your transactions or your list, I'm getting some information about who knows you that could be useful. And let's say you say $40 to Jenny Jones, and you put in the tag describing what it is for babysitting. And then I look up this Jenny Jones lady and I see where she lives. Well, she must live pretty near you if she was doing some babysitting with you. And anytime you can get some sort of clue about a person's day-to-day activities and what they're doing, sometimes a person will say thanks for drinks at Drake's. And
I'm looking at Venmo right now at people that I'm not connected with, but they're connected to people that I'm connected with. And I've got, little emojis saying sushi, RV payment, birthday at King Yang, which is a local restaurant that I know, dresser we broke, which means they were probably in the house at some point, all kinds of information right there, publicly available.
When I first got involved in posting a lot on LinkedIn, one of the first things that I did and what prompted me was that I was fooling around with this, and I started going through my phone or through my Venmo account, and I saw that many, many investigators and high-end attorneys that I knew had totally open privacy settings. And I was like learning things about the personal lives of people that I know. And what was one of my first LinkedIn posts was to say, hey, everyone, you got to just pay attention to this and shape up.
All right, so it's shocking. I mean, every day I learn something new. And one of the things I love about talking to people that are smarter than I am, and you're going to fall into that category, is I learn something new every time I do that. So Venmo payments, for the investigators out there, go through and change your privacy settings. Number two, know that most people don't do that, and you can find a wealth of information there. Another one of my all-time favorites, the situation that got me into the PI business involved this little trick, and it is notary books.
Wow, good. I'm glad I found another person who knows about this. I think notary books are the hidden gem of investigations. Once I realized that I could do this, it was very, very exciting. So when a person goes and signs a document with a notary, and many of you have done this, what do they ask for? They want your driver's license. And then they take out this big official awkward book and they write down all your information off your driver's license on it, including your address. In California, they're also supposed to write down where the notary signing took place. They don't always do that, but they're supposed to do that. And you sign it. And in California, you give a fingerprint. Now, most people have absolutely no idea that the notary book, it's called a notary public, and the notary is actually in a very unusual sort of legal position in which they have to give up the notary line if you request it. You can't ask for the whole book and just photocopy it. But if you have a specific document that you're looking for, you can ask, and they have just like a $2 a page charge. It's like very minimal, de minimis charge, and they have 15 days, and they've got to send you a photocopy completely unredacted of that line. So let's say I've got a property record that you were on, that you signed, that's the most common source of something notarized, then I can just send an email to that notary, and now I'm going to get back the address that's on your driver's license. I'm going to get a signature exemplar. I'm even going to get your fingerprint. I never had anything to do with a fingerprint, but I'm going to have it at least. And if I'm lucky, I'm also going to find out where the notary book was signed. That could be a different place than what's on your driver's license, but that could actually be the place where you live, especially nowadays where mobile notaries are very, very common for real estate transactions. People aren't going into the land title office anymore. The mobile notary comes and they've got contracts with all the deed and title companies. And where that gets signed is incredibly valuable information.
So I had an attorney friend called me. He knew I was a commercial real estate appraiser, and he had a client whose husband was hiding some properties. And he said, can you go find where he's, gotten himself out of owning properties and shunted them to other ownership forms? And I was able to do it. But one of the things that opened it wide open is the same notary public had notarized every one of the documents that I found. So we were able to go to that notary public, get a subpoena for her, and then have her bring the notary book and find 20 other properties that this guy had over the past year and a half shunted off to other, fake corporations. So yeah, notary books are amazing. The last couple here, I'm going to kind of hit these real quick. Surveillance, canvassing, and other gumshoe work. Talk to me about how you use those.
Sure. So, in the end, you really have to just wait for a person to be where you think that they are. And they don't always cooperate because they don't know you're looking for them, and they're living their own lives and they're taking care of their elderly mother, or they're traveling to Cancun. And, during COVID, it was very hard. People were not even leaving the house very much. And in the end, if your process server isn't able to just knock on the door and do it, then you have to just do a surveillance and sit on the house or sit on the post office box and wait for the guy to show up. You can send a package so he gets an alert that he's got a package waiting for him, and just wait outside for the guy to show up to get his package, because that's what any person would do. Source inquiries Again, lawyers are often very skittish about this. They don't want to alert. There's a certain element of it that feels like a little bit like trickery. But I had plenty of success just calling up someone's landlord and asking, "Hey, does this guy still live there?" And landlords are usually very interested in this because they're interested in the financial and legal condition of their tenants. So if you call them up and you say, "I'm working with some people and we're trying to sue your tenant," well, that's something they want to know about. They're interested in it, and so they will just say, he just moved out, or whatever.
Let me throw this up on the screen real quick. With notary, how do you request the information again? I missed what was said.
It says in California, it says you're supposed to send a written request. And the first few times I did it very officially by sending a letter in registered mail. But now I just send an email and they respond. Notaries are not adverse to you in any way in this. They don't care. That has nothing to do with them. They're just a notary.
Yeah, they don't have a dog in the fight. The other gumshoe work that we have on this outline here, I think this is an incredibly important thing. Networks of other investigators. I use this all the time. And I know that there are a couple of my friends in the room that I know do this same thing because we call each other on a regular basis. Talk to me about how you use your network of investigators.
Sure. So I rely very heavily on the investigators that I know and I've worked with, over the last 5 years. I've been on my own, partly for ideas, partly for resources. It's really, really important because especially when I get outside of California, I'm not very familiar with how the laws work, what court records would be available, what kind of DMV records am I allowed to obtain. And what you want is somebody, like Steve Mason in Arizona, and people like that who know that world and you can get on the phone with them or send them an email. And there's I found like a lot of professional courtesy, which is like, "Hey, can you just answer this question?" And if I decide I need to do that, then I just pay him to do it. But anyone can call me from any other state and say, "What's the status of getting DMV records in California?" Or can what's going to happen if I go down to the courthouse in Alameda County? What am I going to be able to get there? And leveraging those is really, really important. And then, of course, you really need it for when you've got to do a serve or a surveillance or something like that. And you've got to find someone because in the end, you've got to get results from the client and you can't put it back on the client. Yeah. I had something that happened about 6 months ago where I located a woman in France through a whole complex series of steps that we won't go through the whole rigmarole, but I was pretty sure based on what I found that she was living in France and I had an address for it and where she was in France in some random little town somewhere. And I had to work my network to find a guy who was in that area of France. I didn't know anyone, but I have a network of people that do. And through that network, I was able to find a really good guy who was able to go and knock on the door in this little garret in some random area in France and find this lady. And I couldn't have done that without my network. Otherwise, yeah. And I can't, like I said, you can't go back to the client and say, "Well, I think they're in France, so hopefully you have someone in France."
Yeah.
Not serving the client.
Avi, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to do this today. I have thoroughly enjoyed my time with you, and I know based on the questions from the crowd and the responses from the crowd, everybody else has enjoyed it too. Tell people real quick how to find you. What's the easiest way to find you?
Find me on LinkedIn. If you search for Avi Klein Investigator on LinkedIn, I am the only private investigator named Avi Klein in all of America. There are lots of other Avi Kleins doing interesting things, but I'm the only private investigator. And I look exactly like how I look here, and I'm even wearing the same hat and glasses, so there'll be no mistake.
I love it. Avi, thank you very much. And folks in the room, thank you for joining us. I'm Hal Humphreys, and that is your partly, sometimes monthly webinar from PI Education, brought to you by Pursuit Magazine. Have a great rest of the week.